Hello, this is Marvin Oxenham from the ICET Academy. And in this course, we're looking at learning design. And in particular, in this video, we want to take a look at what the traditional patterns of learning design are that we typically use in a residential setting. These are patterns of design that we may not be conscious of, that we're actually using them. But as you look at them, you'll see that they're very familiar and that they probably reflect the way that a lot of teaching and learning is designed in a residential context. So I've got some slides here I'm going to show you, and we'll be toggling back and forth as we look at the slides to illustrate this particular content. So let's look at the first slide here. There we go. Okay, so this slide shows us typical learning in an undergraduate setting. So what you see here is sort of at the core, one of the biggest boxes is actually the lecture, and this is where, well, we know what a lecture is. Someone stands up and basically lectures to students. And then you'll notice these boxes have a little bit of blue shading on them, and I've put that in the shading to sort of indicate what students do. And so students typically will be engaged in some sort of formative work, which may be reading assignments, it may be different elements of formative work, and then typically one main piece of assessment. So this could be a main essay, it could be a report, it could be an exam of some sort where students demonstrate that they follow the content of the lectures and that they can reproduce that and perhaps engage with it critically in some way. And then oftentimes there's a feedback that concludes the learning in this traditional design pattern where the teacher then gives feedback to the students on their particular learning. So whether it's comments in an essay or on an exam paper to tell students how they've actually engaged with the learning, how well they've done. So that's a typical undergraduate learning design. Let's look instead at a postgraduate. Oops, sorry. At a postgraduate learning design. So these are students that are more mature. Sometimes this is also called graduate learning. So here students are perhaps in a master's degree or in a taught element of a doctoral program. And here there's the teacher is maybe doing less lecturing. The teacher is setting topics and providing orientation on big themes, and the students, as you can see, they're more engaged. They're doing more delivery, more discussion in seminars, leading seminars, talking to each other in discussion around topics. Again, there's typically an essay or some sort of written, maybe dissertation, a piece of reflection on the learning, and again, a feedback that is given from the teacher to the students on their learning. So what happens then when we go into online learning design? What does that look like? Now, the temptation is that the way that we do it residentially, the learning design that we've used perhaps for many years, if at a certain time we're called to teach online, we simply take the same learning design and we reapply it in the online context. So, for example, what might easily happen is this pattern of design, which we've just seen for the residential undergraduate program, becomes this, where the lecture is replaced by some sort of a video conference. So perhaps a Zoom conference becomes the lecture, after which there's maybe some formative work, there's an essay report, and there's feedback. And so, as you can see, although the medium has changed and it's no longer in a classroom with a lecturer speaking to students from a lectern and students sitting at desks, you've changed the medium and students are sitting in front of a computer and the teacher is sitting in front of a webcam and talking. So really, not much has changed in terms of learning design. And I dare say that some think this is online education, whereas in reality, it's not. It's residential education design that is simply taken and adapted to an online context with a small use of technology. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I'm saying, this is very limiting in terms of the way that online education is designed, simply trying to replicate the design of residential learning. Now, Of course, we won't get into talking about the design of residential learning in this particular video. There could be critical elements about that as well to think, is the actual lecture as the main tool of learning design, is it appropriate? Are there other ways that we can encourage learning and teaching and engage with it beyond the lecture? And there are other courses in the ISET Academy as well where we've dealt with this. We've talked about the lecture and many great things to say about the lecture. But is there more? And I think many educators are starting to discover that there are other ways of designing learning, even in a residential context, beyond the lecture. But let's come back to our question in the online education design. So what are possible ways that we can think of designing in an online context that one, acknowledge the limitations of the technology, but at the same time take advantage of the huge possibilities that these technologies offers to rethink the way that we offer theological education. Now, what you see here in the drawing is what I've called a tripartite learning design. So it's learning design that has 3 parts, and as you'll notice, the student is at the center of the learning process. Whereas often in the previous learning design patterns, we've seen that the teacher, the lecturer, tends to be more at the center, and even the architecture of many of our classrooms demonstrate the centrality of the teaching figure. Here you have the student at the center, engaging with 3 different sources, could we say, or 3 different conversation partners in the learning process. The first conversation partner we've called the resources. Now, the resources are typically the acquisition of materials, and the resources could be of many different kinds. There could be reading resources, so a student could be reading online texts, engaging with journals, reading ebooks. The resources could be free, open educational resources on the internet, again, whether in text form, in audio form, perhaps even video form. Resources can also be video lectures that are produced by the lecturer and then made available to the student. Or the Zoom conversation, a live Zoom conversation, again, could take the form of a resource where there's input, there's information that the student can engage with as a resource. The second source of conversation is the teacher, or we may also call the figure in online education may not be the teacher, but maybe better to call this person a tutor. Because the teacher is not simply talking all the time to the students, but the tutor is accompanying the student in their learning as they engage with the resources. So typically what a tutor would do, a teacher tutor, if a student engages in perhaps reading 2 articles that compare different views on a certain theological topic, then what the teacher will do, or the tutor, they will design learning that will help students think critically, verbalize their thoughts on the differences, maybe notice differences that hadn't been noticed before. And so the tutor becomes, in online education, more of sometimes what is called the guide on the side. Where the resources represent the authority and the input into the actual topic matter, and the tutor then walks with the student and helps the student engage with the resource. And the third very important part in online education is the engagement of student to student. And there's so much learning that can happen as students engage with each other. And so in online education, when we design online education, we design opportunities and give guidance and use the available technologies to allow these constructive conversations and dialogue and engagement to happen between students. So typically you could design an online learning unit, perhaps starting with a resource, perhaps some reading and some videos to watch on on a particular topic, and then you could set the students to talk together about that, perhaps in a discussion forum where they can present counterpoints and take positions and discuss the actual topics or share what they found, what they thought from the resources. And the teacher tutor who also would have input into the discussion forum, input into the conversation, guide the students as they're learning together, as they engage with the resource. So you can see the design has slightly shifted from having one main event, which is the lecture, to having a combination of different conversation partners that are designed to interact with the student. Now let me just give you one final slide here. This slide shows us how, when we design online education, we are actually designing for participation. Online education gives huge possibilities for students to actually participate actively in their learning and not just as passive listeners. So if you look at this graph, look, for example, let's look at the blue line first, which corresponds to the chart we saw before of typical undergraduate design. Now, what happens here is that during delivery, the teacher has a very high input, which means that when the delivery is happening, therefore typically in the lecture hall, the level of input from the teacher is very high. Typically they talk for 15 minutes, so there's a very high level of input. In terms of preparation of the teacher in typical undergraduate learning design, there's a medium level of preparation because the teacher has to obviously study, prepare notes, do the research, perhaps present media as well to accompany a lecture. So there's a medium level of engagement in the preparation of the teacher. But then if you look at the learner participation in a typical undergraduate learning design, the learning participation is quite low. It very often takes the form of sitting and taking notes, and perhaps at the end of the lecture asking a question or having a small discussion. So typically the learner participation is low and the teacher input is quite high. If instead we look at the red line, we see here that in postgraduate education, so the second chart we saw, the teacher input during delivery is lower. Because the teacher is not lecturing all the time. There's more student seminars happening. The teacher input in preparation, again, is lower because more responsibility is being given to the student to actually do the research, to prepare the seminars, and whatnot. And the learner participation is much higher because the students in postgraduate, master level, doctoral level education typically are doing presentations themselves. They're talking with their fellow students, they're presenting the subject matter in master level seminars or whatnot. And finally, if you look at the green line is actually the e-learning or the online education. And here you notice that the teacher input during delivery is the lowest in the sense that when you design online education, the teacher is not always talking, is not always giving input. The teacher is often taking the role, as we've seen, out of the tutor, of the guide on the side. So the input during delivery is relatively low. But look at the level of input from the teacher in preparation. It is actually the highest. Because what is very important in online education is the preparation of the course materials. Those resources that we saw in the previous slide are the most important thing when students actually engage in their learning. So they come into a virtual learning environment or whatever sort of platform you have, and the materials that they find there, whether it's a selection of readings, whether it's written text, whether it's video, whether it's audio, whether it's resources on the web or whatnot, these have been carefully curated and put together by the teacher to facilitate and to direct the learning of the students. So you'll notice here the difference between an undergraduate and an online teaching design. You are actually spending a lot of time as an online teacher preparing the materials that the students and designing the learning beforehand. That's why it's so important to understand learning design in online education. Because if you don't design well here, it will be a terrible experience for students online, and learning will not happen. And finally, if you look at learner participation, again, in online education, it is the highest. This is where students are most actively participating, engaging with the resources, with their fellow students, with the tutor, as this triangulation of conversation partners come together and the learner actively participates in her or his learning. So this is a brief introduction to learning design, the way we do it traditionally, and the way we might think differently about doing it in online education.